Thank you very much, Frankie, for that kind introduction, and Chris as well. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see this room so filled. Thank you really for coming. I'd also like to thank Aline White of the Vermont Humanities Council, who first reached out to me and asked me to be a part of the First Wednesdays series for this year. And also, I feel quite grateful to be in other parts of the state in such good company tonight. I know Rosemary Gladstar is speaking tonight in Burlington and she's a kind of amazing herbalism guru for those of you who don't know her. My colleague from Dartmouth, Nancy J. Crumbine, is in Montpelier tonight talking about poetry and poetry's spiritual language. So anyway, I feel very humbled and grateful to be in such good company. And also as a mother, as a writer, but also as a mother of a young child just learning to read, who happens to be sitting in that room over there in the kids' room, very grateful to the Vermont Humanities Council that it exists and that the kind of programming that you bring to different ages is out there for residents of Vermont. I'd also like to thank, of course, all the people that you'll meet throughout the evening in my pictures and in my words, people really without whom my work in many direct ways, my career wouldn't be, but more than that, folks who are really good friends and who have been teachers and guideposts throughout the last decade and a half of my life. So just to give you a little sense of what I'll do in the next 45 minutes or so, I'd like to start just by evoking, if you will, some of the places that I've spent time with a combination of images and words, and then to tell you a little bit more about how I came to write Horses Like Lightning, what the book is about, and to read a small section from it, and then really to talk about some of the points of social and economic, ecological, and political change that a place like Mustang, a remote Himalayan kingdom, is going through in 2009, and some of the ways that on the surface, perhaps a place that's very rural, traditional, we can put lots of other adjectives onto it, is also very much part of this modern global world, and to think about some of the points of interconnection. So first, the evocation, such as it is. The steppe, valleys, and peaks whose contours define the Tibetan and Himalayan world grant humanity no easy life. Yet this landscape has been peopled for centuries and is marked by their makings. Cairns and temples, villages, fields, and even cities have cropped up with time, conferring names on these places, making them home. Memory holds fast to cool, dry earth. Wind carves this landscape with equal force.
Why don't you turn the lights down a little bit?
This is an unforgiving place for all its beauty. Now I'm going to squint a little. I think my eyes will adjust, but Mustang, Nepal, there. Is that okay for all of you? Okay, perfect. That makes me not go blind. Mustang, Nepal, and the other places in which I've been fortunate to spend time have made me more attentive to the stories that live within a landscape. These places are touchstones. They guide me as I learn to live within the bounds of a culture very different than my own. Many of the places in which I work and about which I write are remarkable not only because of their majesty, but also because they have survived and continue to survive through massive transitions, most of them caused by humanity's capacity both for creation and destruction. Here I not only reference Mustang's craggy cliffs and crumbling caves, or its villages and monasteries, filled as they are with artistic treasures and a rich transforming cultural heritage. In my mind's eye, I also see the contours of the Potala Palace in Tibet, framed as it is by nomad women at its skirts, prostrating at its skirts, and the wind-whipped flag of red and gold that marks this space as Chinese territory. I feel the rush of pilgrims walking past me on the Barkor, or the marketplace of central Lhasa. I hear the postmodern melange of brassy Hindi pop tunes, sonorous Tibetan mantra, and the chatter of circumambulators around the Bodhnath Stupa in Kathmandu, as feet shuffle along slate, walking a saffron sunset down. These are not my places, but they are places to which I am indebted, places that move and ground me by turns. To Tibetans, geography is not merely a thing to be mapped with reference to topography and material utility. Here in High Asia, survival depends as much on a people's ability to reap harvests, trade with acumen, and tend herds as it does on myth, imagination, and a collective reverence for the natural world. Mountains, lakes, and rivers are the abodes of protector deities, serpent spirits, Buddhist saints. Tibetan pilgrimage guides read like epic poetry, charted in metaphors instead of miles. These guides are often buried in earth or cave. As the mythology goes, such treasure texts, or terma as they're known in Tibetan, are revealed only when pilgrims and practitioners are ready to receive them. I find resonance here, poetry to be found, to lend meaning to place. So, as a way of getting us started, this is me in Mustang, and what I'd like to do is just give you a sense, especially for those of you who've not looked at the book before or had a chance to read it, how I came to spend time in these parts of the world, in particular in Mustang, and kind of what my trajectory has been. I grew up nowhere near Vermont. I grew up in Southern California in Santa Barbara. And my dad was an archaeologist, and my mother's a painter. My stepfather, whose photographs you just saw, is a photographer. So I've kind of been around people who have made their lives both through art and through the study of culture and cultural change. My stepfather spent a lot of time with the lowland Maya in Mexico. My father spent years working with the Chumash Native Americans in Southern California. So I grew up with really a sense of curiosity, particularly about religion and other ways of making sense of the world aside from a kind of Judeo-Christian frame. My parents didn't really raise me with any particular religion, but I spent a lot of time in sweat lodges as a kid. And I went to Catholic school, though I wasn't Catholic, which at some level was the beginning, I think, of my anthropological experience. But through all of this, I found horses. And I found horses also at a time when my parents were splitting up and things were tumultuous at home. And horses grounded me, quite literally, and provided this really amazing lens into what I consider very much a spiritual connection between human and non-human beings. And, I competed and I spent time in the barn growing up and had no idea, though, that at some point these interests would actually converge. And they did start to converge when I was an undergraduate at Brown. I was a religious studies major, and the world's religions continued to fascinate me. I decided to go to Nepal on a study abroad program actually run through SIT, School for International Training, which is down in Brattleboro, and a place that's actually near and dear to my heart. When I went to Nepal, I had visions of going and spending time in a Buddhist nunnery, quite frankly. I was very interested in women's religious experience. It was something that I had studied in school. But then I got to Nepal, and I met an anthropologist who has since become a very close friend, who worked in this place called Mustang. And he showed pictures of this landscape, which I've just shown you pictures of, and I was completely entranced, and especially entranced by the fact that there were horses there. And so I sort of timidly asked him, horses. You know, is there something worthwhile doing a project for me as an undergraduate going off to this place for a month? Can I learn something? Would it be something that would make sense if I went and said I wanted to learn about horses? And he said yes, very much so, and gave me some initial contacts, including the fellow here in the middle. His name is Tsampa Nawang. Tsampa literally means someone who's done a 3-year retreat. So he's a religious practitioner, but also he's a doctor and someone who's a very good horseman. And I was told that Tsampa and other people in Mustang actually had horse texts. These were either extant local texts that talked about how to care for a horse, rituals to do to protect a horse, either from illness or from attacks by wild animals, but also that spoke to the kind of deeper place that horses occupy within the greater Tibetan cultural world. When you read Tibetan Buddhist texts, the horse comes up a lot as a metaphor for the mind. And many times you also hear references for the horse carrying the norbu, or the precious jewels of the Buddha's teachings. And all of this really intrigued me. I had never kind of thought beyond my own interest in horses, which was very personal, outward to an environment and a culture perhaps only rivaled by Mongolia, that really depended on horses, both for some of its sense of itself and also for really practical things like plowing fields and threshing grain and moving from place to place. And something about this also really resonated with me. So this is a picture from 1993 when I was 19 and I went on this trip to Nepal for my first time. And these are a couple of pictures of me and friends, and here me with horses. During the year and change that I spent after I finished my undergraduate degree at Brown as a Fulbright scholar. So I was very fortunate to get one of these at-large Fulbrights that allows people before going into graduate school to pursue an independent research project. And my project was really an extension of what had started during that semester on SIT. And so the project was really focused a lot on spending time with local doctors and veterinary experts, learning about the different plants that are used to heal horses in this environment and the other strategies, but also getting a sense of the economics behind horses in this region. How much does it cost for a tourist to rent a horse? Is there a competition locally for who rents horses to tourists? Many other questions that sort of spilled out from that. And so this time in Nepal was my first real foray into long-term anthropological fieldwork. This happened to be before I started graduate school, and I'm actually really thankful for that. I think that a lot of why I'm an anthropologist and a lot of what carried me through actually some of the drudgery of graduate school was this really deep knowledge and sensibility that comes from just immersing yourself in a place. During this time, I had basic Nepali language already, but I learned to speak the local dialects of Tibetan and to improve my Nepali. This is a picture of the king of Mustang. Now, I'll talk more about Mustang past, present, and future in a few moments, but suffice it to say that this Himalayan kingdom is indeed a kingdom. The Mustang is divided into sort of upper and lower quadrants, and I spent time in both areas. But the reason that I chose to show this picture of the king here is that he's also an excellent horseman. And the king is someone who I tried my very best to spend as much time with as I could, because he's also really, in many ways, the last of his generation. I know his son quite well and his grandson, and they do maintain connections to Mustang, but he will be the last person to really rule this kingdom, which has been a kingdom since the 14th century, by virtue of living on that land, working that land, riding the horses of this place. And he's someone who I very much came to admire. This is Mustang circa 2008, but it's also a way of showing that although there are many places in Mustang that, as the first pictures I showed you illustrate, that still look quote-unquote untouched, that don't look very modern. Mustang indeed is a meeting ground of a lot of different lives and lifeways, and I'll talk again toward the end of the talk more about shifts from horses to motorcycles, for instance, and a road that's coming into Mustang. But really, and also just one other thing to say here, the Dancing Yak Lodge is Tsampa Nawang's establishment in his home, and a place that I spent a lot of my year. The book Horses Like Lightning took about a decade to write in certain ways. It's not that I was working on it the whole time, but I came back from Mustang and started to write some academic papers and some magazine articles and things to essentially start to process my experience, and then went from there into graduate school and started then to add on to that experience the overlay of comparative perspective. Other societies that were pastoral or agro-pastoral, going through different kinds of transitions. And I also added into the mix later on a child. So the book took a while to percolate, but in part it was because I had to figure out how to tell this story. When I first started thinking about what to do with all this information I had collected about horses and horse care and local medicine and the economics of the horse trade in the region, it was very difficult for me to sort of reckon that with the very personal experiences and transformations that I went through during the year that I lived in Mustang. And at first, my tendency was to completely write myself out of the story, and actually to write a book of historical fiction. So the first draft of this book was that, and it really focused actually on a piece of Mustang's history, which I also learned a lot about. From 1960 to 1974, Mustang was essentially the seat of operations for the Tibetan resistance movement, or as they're colloquially known, the Khampas. Khampa literally means a person from eastern Tibet, and the Tibetan resistance movement basically got started in eastern Tibet, which is why it has that name. But Khampas also, they brought with them the ravages of a people displaced. They brought with them their proclivities and their mission, essentially to wage guerrilla warfare with the PLA across the border. But they also brought all this knowledge about horses, and they brought a sense to Mustang that horses were valuable in ways that before the 1960s, as I discovered through my research, they were really not as important. People either walked more, they had more mules. Horses were only really for the local nobility. So I spent a lot of time with the old resistance fighters who still actually live in Mustang, and became very fascinated by that piece of this history, because at that point, now there are a couple of good books out actually about the Tibetan resistance that include a discussion of Mustang, but at the time I was doing this work, it was as if this piece of this war and this really important part of Tibetan history that was also a very important part of Mustang's history was kind of nowhere. And so the book started out really as wanting to kind of make sense of and pay some kind of a tribute to this piece of Mustang's history and Tibetan history. But from there, the book continued to evolve, and eventually it really did turn into what I call ethnographic memoir. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and the historical fiction is still in a file, and I may come back to it someday. But I did really return to this idea that it was plausible, and not only plausible, but probably the right thing to do at this stage in my life, to integrate the ethnographic experience and this all that I did learn about horses with my own coming of age, really, and my own transformation into a professional anthropologist. It also was a chance for me to, I think, reflect on the ways that I was shaped by horses, but still coming to Mustang was confronted with what it meant to live by the land and to rely on animals in this new way. And here are just a couple of images of horses in the land in Mustang to kind of illustrate that. Horses appear, oops, I don't know why that skipped so quickly. Horses appear all over the place. The picture on the left here is an image of a horse, again, carrying the norbu, the precious jewels of the Buddha's teachings there on its back. And on the right here, this is actually from Dolpo, Nepal, so where Peter Matheson wrote The Snow Leopard. It's west of Mustang. And you can see that there's a little charm hanging off of the horse as a way of indicating that people do all sorts of things to protect their horses, not just by giving them good food to eat, etc., but they do religious rituals for them. A very important riding horse will get a very proper burial, if you will. Horse skulls are placed on the roof of houses when horses die to make sure that the nor, the wealth of the household, doesn't leave with the death of the horse. So again, there's a real integration between what horses mean and their utility and this other kind of larger social and religious sensibility. Just a couple of other pictures sort of that mark the trajectory of this book. Here's Tsampa on the left there, circa 1996. And this is me bringing back copies of the book to Tsampa in 2008. We've continued our relationship, as I have with all of the people in the book, really. And this has been something that has given me great joy, but that was also difficult when I was trying to, again, conceive of this book project. Where does it end? Because you know, I have continued to go back. I lived in Nepal from 1995 to 1998. I've continued to go back basically every year since for at least a month or so. And so these people who I was starting to turn into characters, if you will, in this text are also real life people who I have, you know, I get calls from at midnight still and have ongoing relationships with. And so one of my biggest challenges, but I think one of the things I ultimately learned the most from in crafting this book was actually thinking about how to maintain something of that balance between innocence and experience, to try and evoke what it was like for me as a 19-year-old or a 22-year-old when I went back to live in this place and in my own process of becoming, and yet also to add into the text all the stuff that's happened in between in some ways, or at least to give some context for it. So now I'd just like to give you some visual images to go with some of the characters in the book, for those of you who maybe have read it or who may read it in the future. The person on the right is my dear friend Gyatso, and he is a Tibetan doctor as well as a religious practitioner. And his father there, Tashi Chusang, is on the left. In the book, you read of Tashi Chusang's death. And he was someone who I spent, again, like the king, a lot of time with, learning about horses, but also learning really in a greater sense about Tibetan medicine and about the kinds of transitions that this ancient healing practice is going through as it tries to both defend and transform itself in the modern world. Again, another picture of the king on the left there and the crown prince on the right. Another strand of the book is really about this family and about questions of succession and what will happen to this ancient kingdom once the now 74-year-old king and his queen pass on. What will become of a place that was ruled for so long by someone who made his home 9/10 of the time in this region. And when that transfers to someone who's been educated in India and in Kathmandu, who very much maintains a connection to Mustang, but whose fundamental home is actually in the capital, in Kathmandu, and whose son happens to be now in Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island. So, you know, you see globalization actually happening before your eyes. This is my dear friend Pasang, and with that I'd like to just read a little section from a chapter in the book that is about her. Before doing that, though, I would like to make one comment, and that is I spent a lot of time with old men, and as a young woman that was always a kind of interesting dynamic. There was never any sort of, you know, sexual innuendo or weirdness in that respect, but it was kind of unusual for a young woman who, you know, knew her way around a horse, but, you know, to spend her time with old guys talking about plants, talking about shoeing horses and riding and learning how to train a horse, because this was very much a male domain. It was something, my foreignness in the end trumped my femaleness, and I was able to kind of enter those worlds without too much problem. But there were certain moments during, especially the intensive year or so that I lived in Mustang, that I really longed for female company. And so part of what emerged really out of that year were two very important female relationships, one of which is with Pasang, the other is with a woman named Dawa, who is actually from Shigatse, Tibet, and she's the niece of the queen of Mustang, both of whom I write about in the book. But I'd like to just give you a little sense of Pasang. So I'll read for between 5 and 10 minutes, so bear with me. This is from the chapter called Wood Smoke and Radishes. A southern wind churned up the sky as I rode north from Jomsum toward Lubra. Nilgiri Himal yielded its summit to a patch of clear, thin atmosphere in an otherwise stormy sky. Rain clouds gathered and chilling sprinkles spat on the dusty ground. These drops would turn to snow by nightfall if they did not become hail first. I rode slowly despite the weather. Hurrying through this afternoon with its chill and rainbows and iridescent streaks of light was not possible. I would get to Lubra when I got there. My horse stopped to drink at the crossroads of the Kaligandaki River and the Panda Kola. He gulped, not minding the rain, and I took pleasure in the pause. Lubra was a mere bend in the river away. Truly alone for the first time in weeks, I simply stared at the cliffs, these welcome markers of familiar territory. The vertical canyon walls that form one side of the valley were scarred with bedrock ripples. At one point in time, this rock had been ocean floor. The opposite side of the valley was dotted with juniper trees and dwarfed pines, hardy shrubs and shale, providing Tibetan blue sheep places to forage and take shelter during the winter. Cairns marked this landscape, some adorned with the horns of blue sheep and yak, while others were splashed with red and natural pigments. I continued toward the village and crossed the river. Early in these lean months of spring, this fording was still possible at any time of day. In summer, the river swelled with glacial melt and monsoon rains, washing out bridges and making the task of crossing the river quite treacherous. I heard few sounds save the trees and the water, as I turned east and guided my horse through the maze of river stones to the village entrance. Looking toward the outcropping of small houses and buildings, I felt an odd sense of homecoming. Even though Lubra was not a village where I had conducted any formal research, it had become something of a haven over these past 6 months. From the first time I met Pasang, I felt a deep affection for her. She had a lively sense of humor and a deep knowledge of this landscape and its people. I came to cherish the days and nights passed under Pasang's roof. Mustang's history lived in her. Just sitting around her hearth, listening to her talk down her day, was a lesson in Mustang's culture, its complexity. Pasang was always warm and welcoming. She easily made me forget my foreignness and allowed me to become her friend. Like several other villages in Mustang, Lubra was a Bon settlement, not a Buddhist one. Bon is the sort of name for the pre-Buddhist or shamanistic, in some senses, religious traditions of the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalaya. Since I was now in Bon territory, I led my borrowed horse around the cairn, announcing the entrance to Lubra in a counterclockwise direction, instead of the clockwise fashion that marks a Buddhist circumambulatory path. The horse's bell jingled, signaling my arrival as I passed under the canopy of an ancient walnut tree and through the main cluster of dwellings toward Pasang's house. I found Pasang standing on the roof of her home. As I approached, all I could see of my friend was her stiff woven apron folded into a triangle and wrapped around her waist in the convention of Mustang's women. The tip of this striped outer garment stuck up like the feathers of an exotic bird. As I moved closer, I saw that she was fixing a plastic sheet over her kitchen's open skylight, anticipating a night of snow. "You've come? In this weather?" She gestured toward the menacing sky. "Are you crazy?" she joked. I laughed out loud at her endearments. Had I caught a cold? Had the journey been terrible? Oh, my aching bones, my sore feet. This is no place for people to live, I giggled. Her laughter echoed mine with a boisterous burst of joy. Come in, you must be hungry, she called as she climbed down from the roof. What kind of host am I? I haven't even made tea. Pasang, I just got here. There's plenty of time for tea, I said, grasping her hands. Warm palms, cold fingertips. Once inside, I sat down near Pasang as she stoked the fire, poured water into a soot-stained pot, and set it to boil. Smoke filtered up through the chimney, one of the few in this village, and a novelty, at least at that time, still in some of Mustang's villages. Further north in Lo, wood is replaced as fuel almost exclusively by animal dung. Chimneys are rare. Inside such houses, air grows thick with smoke. Eyes sting. One struggles to see, let alone breathe, as plumes of smoke make their way through skylights and small windows. A wooden cabinet was propped up against the wall near the hearth. Dingy jars whose painted logos, Nescafe, Mechi tea, had all been worn off, rested on the shelves. Other recycled plastic containers, vessels that once held hand lotion or ghee, now bore the distinctive marks of food and fire. Grease around the edges, a plastic lid deformed by flame. Pasang's house smelled of cumin and wild garlic, of wood smoke and radishes. It was here that I came to feel most at home in Mustang. Although much of this had to do with Pasang's kindness and affability, there was something about her and her home which ignited in me deep childhood memories. Sitting in her small kitchen with her stove puffing, I felt the same sense of warmth and calm that I had experienced as a very young child, when my father was out working as an archaeologist, and I passed hours in the company of Chumash women and girls, talking and making tortillas. Also, as an only child, I've always tended to gravitate toward relationships that filled some intuited need for a sibling, and Pasang was such a person. She was sisterly. Her friendship helped me to negotiate a new sense of internal balance and belonging, now that I had uprooted myself, chosen to leave my home and natal family, and settled, at least for the time being, halfway across the world. So there's more to Pasang, but I'll leave that there. So now I'd actually like to talk a little bit more about what Mustang is and has become, and then to really open it up to questions, comments, and more of a dialogue about what I call a culture in transition. I purposely gave you the pretty pictures first, and now I'm giving you the map. But just for those of you who don't have a sense of where Mustang is, it's this thumb that juts out into the Tibetan plateau there in Nepal. And this is what the actual district looks like, its borders and its boundaries. Mustang, as you can tell from the map here and from the photos that you saw, lies in what's called the rain shadow of the Himalaya. In other words, much of the district is actually on the northern side of the Great Himalayan Range, and so therefore is a lot drier than other parts of the Himalaya. You, of course, have a kind of an east-west gradient in the Himalaya, so it's wetter to the east and drier to the west in general, but Mustang in particular is quite arid in many places. Mustang is also, by virtue of this really, I don't have a pointer, but oops, sorry. By virtue of this very nice straight shot of a valley here, it has been, and its location vis-a-vis Tibet, it's been a major trade route for centuries. Mostly the exchange of lowland grains from the middle hills or the lowland parts of Nepal for Tibetan salt. But also now for all sorts of other things, from Chinese thermoses and iodized Indian salt to, to religious figures. The Karmapa was actually scuttled out of Tibet via Mustang, in part because it is such an easy border to cross. There's no big, giant mountain range to pass. You have a lot less of the worries that come with trying to cross from Tibet into Nepal in the Everest region, for instance. It's a place that houses about 12,000 people, and that is home to a variety of ethnic groups. I spent a lot of my time, or most of my time really, with people who are culturally Tibetan, meaning they speak a dialect of Tibetan, they practice Tibetan Buddhism or Bon, and they live very much like their neighbors across the border do in terms of their livelihood strategies. They grow a lot of barley, they keep yak and crossbreeds. But Mustang District is also home to other ethnic groups, the main one being a group called the Takali, who have also gained over the years a real reputation as middlemen, cultural and economic, between the high mountains of Nepal and the lowland Hindu majority. People of Takali extraction kind of move between these worlds with a lot of fluency. They can kind of adopt the culture and language and mannerisms of high caste Hindu Nepal, make their way and have made their way into the political power structure in Nepal, and yet they also are pulled in the other direction. And historically, many of the Takali were tax collectors for the king in the Kathmandu Valley, essentially customs officers and things like this. They really controlled the trade across this major trade route. The picture that you see on the right here is Jomsom, the district capital, and where the Dancing Yak Lodge is located. And I'll get back to this question of the road in a second, but I'd just like to point out that in this picture, this is taken kind of from the opposite place where that picture of the horses and the motorcycles were, but remember that there are horses and motorcycles here, there are mules here, and then over here you see a Jeep. So really, again, this is the district headquarters is really a melting pot, or in some ways perhaps the salad bowl metaphor is better, for different sorts of trade, different kinds of people. And Jomsom also houses a large army base, a Nepali army base. And this was significant both at the time of the Tibetan resistance. It kind of, in some ways, came into being as a result of kicking the Khampa out or making them disarm in the early 70s. But it proved to be quite a useful thing during the 10 years of civil war that Nepal has just gone through, 1996 to 2006. For those of you who aren't aware, there was essentially a long and very bloody civil war between Maoist insurgents and the Nepali army and police. Mustang was the only district out of Nepal's 75 that was not a site of armed combat in 10 years. And in part it's because, in some ways, people say of this large army barrack, other people say it's quite jokingly sometimes, oh, you know, the Khampas, they got rid of all the trees. There's nowhere for any Maoists to hide here. So, you know, we didn't have the problem with the Maoists. But beyond that, there's also this sensibility that people in Mustang have been really savvy traders for a very long time, capitalism with Mustangi characteristics perhaps, but it's not a place where Maoism and communism as an ideology really took hold at all. There are some outcroppings certainly of young communist groups in the region, and politics are changing. And some of my friends did have to leave during the Civil War for political reasons, but for the most part it's been a place that has been immune to a great extent from the kinds of bloodshed and conflict that the rest of Nepal has seen. It's also quite obviously, when you see all these big buildings and there's an airport right on the other side of this lodge, it's been a place that has attracted a lot of tourists for a very long time. Mustang, at least the lower part of the district, is part of the Annapurna trekking circuit. And so second only really to the Everest region in Nepal in terms of numbers of tourists coming in. And yet that really only holds true for the southern and eastern part of the district. Northern Mustang, where the king lives, has been a restricted territory essentially since tourism got started in Nepal foreigners were not allowed to go to Upper Mustang until 1991, and still a special permit, which costs more money than the regular trekking permit, is required to go to Upper Mustang. This has real world effects for people from these two different parts of the district. In the sense that tourism and the money from tourism continues to be clustered and dominated by people that live in the region that is unrestricted. And it's meant to a large extent that the benefits of tourism, such as they are for people from the upper part of the district where the king lives, have really not reached folks up there. They've been kept, the profits have really been kept in the pockets of politicians in Kathmandu and trekking companies that lead people up through this area. Again, just a picture of contrast, simultaneous realities. You have the young man from Mustang here with his motorcycle, on which he has his saddlebags. So, you know, it's this kind of hybrid where, you know, you get rid of the horse, but you keep the accoutrement. And your fancy old riding horse, well, now you trade it for a fancy Yamaha, but it's still kind of serving the same purpose. It's a status symbol, especially for young men. You have this reality going on, and then you have the reality on the right, which is people hand threshing barley grain up north of Lomantang, which is the capital city where the king lives. Not only, obviously, is there a real difference in architecture, but there's also a real difference in lifestyle. People who are living close to the district center at this point, they have electricity, they have, to a certain extent, running water, they have satellite television, and people in Upper Mustang, for the most part, continue to live without any of those things. And so, again, this is another way of kind of marking the register of marginality and remoteness through the district just by virtue of moving south to north. Since I'm a medical anthropologist, I had to throw in some pictures of medicine. One of the things that is really changing right now in Mustang is how and why and for what reasons people seek out different forms of healthcare and even have access to healthcare. Much of the population in Mustang is treated not necessarily by biomedical drugs, Western drugs, like you see here. This is a government dispensary at a local health post, but rather by amshi, people like Tsampa, traditional doctors, essentially, who practice different forms of Tibetan medicine. That's not to say that people have a kind of a bias against access to Western medicine, but rather that the Western type care that's available in rural Mustang is often of very poor quality. Many of those drugs in there are expired, for instance. People that are government health workers who come to live or are stationed in Mustang often don't speak local languages or dialects. There's a cultural difference. Many of them come from dominant Hindu parts of Nepal. They come into a Buddhist community, and there's a certain amount of friction or just mistrust about the care that they'll give. It's Mustang, like many places in Nepal, indeed many parts of the world, embraces different strategies for dealing with health and illness. If people are really seriously ill and if they have means, they get the heck out of Mustang. They go to Kathmandu, they go to Pokhara and seek emergency services there. But given the fact that that often costs a fair amount of money for local people, the poorer families and poorer individuals often end up also by default relying only on Tibetan medicine or more exclusively on Tibetan medicine. There's a whole other layer of healing that, of course, occurs, and that is in the realm of ritual healing, different kinds of dietary practices that are advised by doctors. And this is something that troubles or complicates, perhaps, our understandings of the divide between medicine and science. But for people in Mustang, these lines are put together differently. And yet come to rest quite comfortably next to each other. There's not a lot of dissonance, and this is an interesting way of illustrating that point. Here you have a monk who's also trained as a Tibetan doctor, giving an IV of glucose to his ailing mother, right? And here you have his brother, actually, who's also a doctor, reading the pulse in a very traditional style of a woman patient at one of the clinics that I'm involved with in Mustang. So there's not a lot of ideological dissonance about, oh, you know, if I'm going to use Tibetan medicine, then should I not use Western medicine? It's much more a question of access and political economy that decides what people do and how they try and address their health problems, of which there are a lot. I mean, you saw some images of the hard manual labor that people do, arthritis, different kinds of back pain, as well as infectious diseases such as TB and hepatitis are really endemic in a lot of Mustangi communities. So there are serious health issues that people face there. Okay, why are we in New York? Well, we're in New York. We're in Queens. This is, you know, the bridge going into Manhattan there, or one of the subway lines rather. We're in New York because a lot of Mustangis are in New York now. When I left Mustang in 1996, 97, it really began what has continued for more than the past decade, an exodus of especially young people, not just to boarding schools in Pokhara or Kathmandu, but to the US, also to Japan and Korea, in search of wage labor. And there are lots of different ways that people get the visas, and there are lots of different ways that they stay. Suffice it to say that they're here, and that in a population of about 9,500 folks in Mustang who are from these kind of ethnically Tibetan areas, 1,100 people live in New York. Many of my interlocutors estimate that about 25% of the working hands, the folks between the ages of 25 and 40, are actually in New York. And this is obviously changing lots of things about Mustang. There's like the rest of Nepal, there's a huge remittance economy. People sending money back to Nepal to individual families from New York to help do things like pay for school fees and pay for laborers to come from lowland Nepal to help their family harvest their fields because they're not there to help. And so there are all these different ways that, that labor migration is changing the social face and the cultural face of Mustang. Oops. So this is a friend who is actually in the book. His name is Wang Di. You'll meet him. He was a monk at the time that I worked with him in the book, but he's now not a monk. He's married. He has a son. And here he is with his Tibetan tanka and his American flag in his house in Queens. This is another friend, Angya, who you also... Actually, I don't talk about Angya directly in the book, though I do thank him. He's a good friend from the Muktinath Valley area, and he's standing behind a new community center that's been built entirely with funds coming back from the U.S. So this is a way of saying that, that just because people are leaving, we should pause and not necessarily ascribe a narrative of cultural decline to this community or to this set of people. That really what's happening is a metamorphosis and a transformation in how people understand the value of their heritage, what it means to be from a place like Mustang, and how, from as far away as Astoria, you can continue to have a relationship with that place. And one of the ways that people are doing that is, again, by sending money to build things. And part of the psychology and the economics behind that is that Mustang, like many places in Nepal, has over time received a lot of foreign aid from NGOs, from governments, and there's been some real good that's come out of that, but there's also been problems and ways that people in Mustang now see the remittance money coming in from their own family members and from their own communities as a way of actually getting to do things their way without having to be accountable to donors. And so it's this really interesting model, if you will, of community development that is quite different than a direct NGO model or getting to a point where they're hoping eventually that the Nepali government will actually give them more resources and give them more attention. This is a giant community center that's built, again, by remittance money. It cost about $60,000 US to build. It's a temple, it's a community center, it's a place where old people can stay or infirm people who come to Kathmandu for treatment. And this is right at the base of Swayambhunath, the big, the monkey temple and one of the big main Buddhist sites in the Kathmandu Valley. Again, as a way of saying that community is being refashioned and revisioned. It's not just all of a sudden being lost. Of course, the fact that people are not in Mustang is an issue and is something that folks are contending with. And I'm almost done here, but just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of returning, essentially, in 2008 with my daughter. This is Gyatso, and there's Pasang holding my daughter, another friend, Sultrum, who's also in the book. This is a way of saying a little bit about the ways that my connections to Mustang have continued over time. So, I went to Nepal, I spent these 3 years, I wrote, started writing this book, went to graduate school, and really ended up focusing in graduate school on a couple of themes, both really to do with the fate of Tibetan medicine or the fate of a traditional and ancient practice in the contemporary world and the ways that it's both transforming and defending itself. So I've spent a lot of years at this point working with doctors, here's Gyatso again, like Gyatso and Sampa, but really from across the Nepal Himalaya. So I work a lot with a group called the Himalayan Amshi Association. And we just were at this big congress on traditional medicine in Nepal, in Bhutan. I've also spent a fair amount of time in Tibet working on issues of women's health and on the intersection, really, in practical and even clinical terms of Western medicine and Tibetan medicine. I worked on a clinical trial, for instance, of a Tibetan formula that was funded by the NIH. Just a couple last pictures here. This is Gyatso and I early in our friendship, and this is Dawa's daughter. So one of my close women friends, her daughter, taking care of my daughter. Again, as a way of saying that the book is done and other research projects continue, but really what happened to me over the course of the last 15 years is that these people and this place have become a part of my life. So just as there are folks now in Queens who I can go visit, so too I hope and I aspire to continue to bring my family to Mustang and to continue to have them inform each other. This is just the final picture showing Ada and I and other friends riding into Lomantang last year. So there's Ada on my back. With that, I'll stop and would love to hear your questions, comments, etc.